Hello, welcome to the podcast. I'm Tim Benjamin, and I'm a composer. Now this episode is the second of two episodes, a two-parter about the music of Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky. Now, if you haven't heard the first of these two episodes, which was about the 1812 Overture, I suggest going back and listening to that before this. Not necessarily because you need to exactly, but because the contrast between the two pieces of music, the 1812 Overture and the one we're going to discuss today, the contrast tells you something about what it means to be a composer and about the gap between what the world wants from you and what you most need to say. Now, in that episode, in part one of this two-parter, we left Tchaikovsky in 1880, aged 40, having written the most famous orchestral showpiece in the world in 6 reluctant weeks and having dismissed it as worthless. He was Russia's most celebrated living composer. He was sustained financially and emotionally by a woman he never met, Nadezhda von Meck, through a correspondence of over 1,000 letters. He was concealing his homosexuality in a society where exposure could mean exile or perhaps worse, and he was, by his own repeated testimony, often wretched. Now this episode, second of our two-parter, follows the last 13 years of his life, a period during which he became an international celebrity. He lost his patroness, he composed the work he considered his masterpiece, he conducted its premiere, and was dead 9 days later. Now that work, the one we're going to look at today, is his 6th symphony, known as the Pathétique. It ends not with a bang, but in silence, the music fading to nothing. The 1880s for Tchaikovsky were enormously productive. Between the 1812 Overture and his death, Tchaikovsky composed what are probably his 3 most famous works for the stage. They are the ballets Sleeping Beauty and The Nutcracker, and the opera The Queen of Spades. I'm sure you will have heard little snippets of Sleeping Beauty and The Nutcracker. They're tremendously famous even today. He also wrote during this time his 5th symphony in 1888 and the Manfred Symphony, which confusingly doesn't have a number in the numbering of Tchaikovsky's symphonies. But he wrote the Manfred Symphony in 1885 and he wrote a great deal else besides. His relationship with his own work was, you could characterize it as volatile, I suppose. He considered Sleeping Beauty, the ballet, which premiered in January 1890, among his finest scores. But he was hurt when Tsar Alexander III, after the premiere, offered only the words, "very nice." Now, for a composer who had poured himself into a score, 2 words of sort of lukewarm approval from the most powerful man in Russia must have stung. I think this "very nice" phrase is something that I have heard, or "very nice," or "that was interesting." This sort of, lukewarm, I think is the right kind of word. And when you hear words like that about a piece that you've struggled with and you've finally had it performed, it does sting a bit. So I can imagine Tchaikovsky feeling a bit annoyed by that. The Nutcracker, the other ballet, on the other hand, he disliked, which is strange because today it's a very well-loved work. He wrote to his nephew, Bob Davidov, and we'll hear more about Bob Davidov in a bit. But anyway, his nephew, and he wrote to him in the summer of 1891 and said, "The ballet, the Nutcracker that is, the ballet is infinitely worse than Sleeping Beauty. Of this I'm sure." He also wrote in the same letter, "The old man is evidently declining. Not only is his hair thinning and turning silver as snow, not only are his teeth falling out and refusing to chew food, but his singular remaining faculty is starting to fade and disappear." Now, he was 51 by this point. I'm just a touch younger than 51, I have to say, and this is quite worrying because at that point he had only 2 years left to live. The Nutcracker, though, went on to become the ballet that keeps ballet companies alive. In the United States alone, it is performed by hundreds of companies every December. New York City Ballet, its 6-week run accounts for around 45% of annual ticket sales. And the Pulitzer-winning dance critic Sarah Kaufman said this is the one ballet that most ballets can't exist without. You can find videos of this ballet, some of them extremely elaborate, on YouTube. And I do encourage you to go and investigate watching The Nutcracker as well as listening to it. It can be quite something with some of these productions. But like the 1812 Overture, it's a piece that the world adores, but that Tchaikovsky himself didn't rate. There's a bit of a pattern here, and we'll come back to that. The Fifth Symphony, another work he wrote during this period, it's important for our story because it shows his pattern of self-doubt. He was pleased with it at first, but then he grew to despise it, telling von Meck, his patroness, that it was a failure. This happened with most of his works. He would finish something, feel a brief sort of flush of satisfaction, and then convince himself it was no good, it was rubbish. The Sixth Symphony, however, breaks this pattern completely. About the sixth, he never wavered in his opinion. During the 1880s, the late 1880s, Tchaikovsky took up conducting, despite being terrified of it. And I mean terrified in a very specific way. At his first major conducting attempt, which was back in 1868, eyewitnesses recalled that he had to hold his head in place with his left hand while conducting with his right hand, because he was convinced his head would topple sideways off his neck if he didn't. He was 28 at the time. You'd think the fear would pass, but it didn't, not for years. But from 1887, when he was in his late 40s, he forced himself to conduct regularly, and it became a second career. His first European conducting tour, which took place in start of 1888, took him to Leipzig, to Hamburg, Berlin, Prague, Paris, and London. He met several other composers, famous composers, along the way. For example, the meeting with Brahms. It's a good one. They met on New Year's Day in 1888 in Leipzig at the home of the violinist Adolf Brodsky and his wife Anna. Now, Anna Brodsky later recalled that the soprano Nina Grieg, she was wife of the composer Edvard Grieg, who was also there. Now, she said, "I cannot sit between these two. It makes me feel so nervous." And Grieg himself swapped places, saying, "But I have the courage." At dinner, Brahms grabbed the strawberry jam, apparently, and refused to share it, which is very amusing to imagine. Brahms hoarding the strawberry jam, Grieg sort of sitting in between Tchaikovsky and Brahms to sort of, because his wife was terrified of sitting between these two towering figures. Just incredible to imagine this dinner. Tchaikovsky and Brahms, now they were very honest with each other about their music. They met again in Hamburg in March 1889. Brahms had delayed his departure specifically to hear Tchaikovsky rehearse his Fifth Symphony. After dinner, they parted as friends, having told each other plainly that they didn't care for each other's music. Tchaikovsky later wrote about Brahms and said, "It is impossible in listening to Brahms's music to say that it is weak or unremarkable. It is all very serious, very distinguished, apparently even original. But in spite of all this, the chief thing is lacking beauty." It's a real composer's verdict, that. Respect for the craft, but reservations about the music. By the early 1890s, Tchaikovsky was receiving international honours and acclaim. In November 1892, he was elected a corresponding member of the French Académie des Beaux-Arts. His candidature was supported by Ambroise Thomas, Gounod, Saint-Saëns, and Massenet. In June 1893, just a few months before his death, he received an honorary doctorate from Cambridge University alongside Saint-Saëns, also Max Bruch, Arrigo Boito, and Grieg, who was too ill to attend. Tchaikovsky stayed to receive this at Downing College with the legal historian F.W. Maitland and his wife Florence. She was a cousin of Virginia Woolf. Tchaikovsky was ill at ease at first in this company, but Florence and her sister won him over by playing the piano for him. And before he left, they pinned a rose to his buttonhole. He conducted the English premiere of his Francesca da Rimini at the Cambridge Guildhall. He told his publisher Jurgensen that Cambridge, quote, "made a very favourable impression. It is pleasant to think of this now, but at the time it was very arduous and exhausting." In April 1891, moving forward a little bit, Tchaikovsky sailed to America. No planes in those days, of course. He sailed to America. He had been invited by the philanthropist Walter Damrosch to conduct at the opening concerts of Andrew Carnegie's new music hall in New York, the building we now know, of course, as Carnegie Hall. He arrived on the 26th of April and spent about 25 days in the country, in the United States of America. He kept a diary, and it's a wonderful, very interesting, fascinating document to have a look at. For example, I'll quote a few things for you because it is quite fun to read, I think. So on New York hospitality, he says, compared with Paris, where at every approach, in every stranger's kindness, one feels an attempt at exploitation, the frankness, sincerity, and generosity of this city, its hospitality without hidden motives, and its eagerness to oblige and win approval are simply astonishing and at the same time touching. He was astonished by the scale of New York, which was quite something, I guess, in those days. It's even more incredible now. But he said about the financial district, the houses downtown are simply colossal. I cannot understand how anyone can live on the 13th floor. He was shown around the sub-treasury and allowed to hold a packet of coins worth apparently $10 million. He was 51 on the 7th of May, which he celebrated by conducting at the opening festival for the new concert hall. In his diary, he wrote, 51 years old. In the morning, I was terribly worried about this day. The American press treated him as a star. In his diary, he says, all of today's papers carry an account of my arrival, complete with a portrait. America knows me better than Europe. But he also grumbled that it makes me angry that they not only write about music, but about me personally. He was also homesick throughout this trip. After a rehearsal on the 30th of April, he wrote, after a light supper, I took a little walk, then read over the letters I have received from Russia and naturally shed a few tears. He also complained about losing a tooth, which meant he now whistled when he kissed his many admirers, and he had a small notebook in his pocket with a list. The list says, things to ask. Is it safe to drink the water in America? What kind of cigarettes do men smoke in New York City? What kind of hats do they wear? Can I get my laundry done there? These are the sort of practical anxieties of someone about to cross the Atlantic in 1891, and they're quite endearing little things to worry about, I suppose. Now, I need to go back a year to 1890 because something happened in 1890 that changed everything for Tchaikovsky. Now, you might remember in the last episode, I described the relationship between Tchaikovsky and his patroness, Nadezhda von Meck. Now, for over 13 years, they had sustained an intense emotional correspondence, over 1,000 letters, on the strict condition that they would never meet in person. That was von Meck's condition, that they must never meet in person. And she funded his freedom to compose without any institutional obligations, and she addressed him as my dear, incomparable friend. He depended on her, not only for money, but for emotional validation, and possibly the emotional need was the greater of these two things. In late September, or perhaps early October 1890, she wrote to him, and it was her last letter. She said she was bankrupt, she was ill, and she must end both her financial support and their correspondence very, very suddenly. She was sending one final year's subsidy in advance, and then, effectively, goodbye. That's it. Tchaikovsky wrote back to her and said, your letter just came. What you have to say grieves me deeply, not for myself, but for you. Certainly, it would be false to pretend that such a radical change in my budget will not affect my material welfare, but it will affect me far less than you probably think. So the money wasn't really the point. By 1890, Tchaikovsky, in fact, was earning very well from conducting fees, despite the risk of his head falling off, from commissions and from royalties, and he had a pension from the Tsar in Russia. What devastated him was that his patroness, von Meck, did not want to write to him anymore. 1,000 letters suddenly stopping just like that. He waited for her next letter in reply to his one, and it never came. He wrote again. Silence. He contacted her family, and he learned gradually that she was probably not bankrupt at all. Her fortune was mostly all intact. Her grown children had been pressuring her to end the relationship, perhaps because they suspected or knew about Tchaikovsky's homosexuality, and perhaps because the gossip about Tchaikovsky and La Mecque, as she was known, embarrassed them. Perhaps because the Tsar's pension had made her financial support unnecessary and she felt her purpose had gone. Perhaps, don't know. But she did have tuberculosis. She had an atrophy of her writing arm that made the physical act of writing of correspondence painful. And the intensely personal nature of their letters made it impossible to dictate them really to a third party as well. All of these things are true, but none of them, I think, is the whole explanation. Tchaikovsky's last letter to her ended like this. Without any exaggeration, I can say that I have never forgotten you and never will forget you even for a single minute. My dear friend, rest assured that I will remember your friendship, compassion, and material assistance until my last breath, and will bless you. Now, we don't know if she ever read that letter, because she died of tuberculosis on the 13th of January 1894, which was only about 2 months after Tchaikovsky himself. Now, Tchaikovsky wrote to his publisher, Jurgensen, like this. All my relationships to her, all of my feelings of warm gratitude, all this has been dragged through the mud. And to his nephew, Bob, it is very, very, very sad. 3 verys. Not the language of a man prone to understatement, that. So Bob Davidov. That brings us to Bob. His actual name, because Bob, I guess, doesn't sound very Russian, does it? His actual name was Vladimir Lvovich Davidov, but he was known as Bob, and he was Tchaikovsky's nephew, the son of his sister, Alexandra. He was born in December 1871, which made him about 40 years younger than his uncle, Tchaikovsky. Now, Tchaikovsky had dedicated his children's album to Volodya Davidov when Bob was 6. The nickname, Bob, came from Bob himself. The family called him Baby, using the English word. For some reason, I guess it was a kind of a joke amongst the family, and then Bob, the baby, couldn't manage to say the word baby. But what did come out was the sound Bob, and so it stuck, sort of a family joke. Tchaikovsky's sister Sasha noticed from the day of Bob's birth that the child resembled his uncle, and from that moment Tchaikovsky showed him a particular tenderness. In his will, Tchaikovsky left Bob all of the copyrights and all of the royalties to his music, which, that's the works of the most performed Russian composer, perhaps one of the most performed composers in the entire world at that time, which gave Bob a substantial income for the rest of his life. Tchaikovsky also wrote to Bob with an intensity that's drawn quite a lot of attention ever since. For example, to his younger brother Modest, he wrote, "To see him, hear him, and feel him close to me will soon become for me, it seems, the paramount condition for my happiness." After the break with his patroness von Meck, and especially after his sister Sasha's death in 1891, Bob became the person Tchaikovsky was closest to. The letters really are striking. In 1891, he wrote to Bob, "You are constantly in my thoughts, because with each sensation of sadness, anguish, mental torments, and dark clouds on every horizon, the knowledge that you exist, and that I will be back to see you in the near future is like a ray of light." Now, he considered moving from Klin to St. Petersburg to live nearer to him. Bob, for his part, wrote back. For example, "I just can't reconcile myself to the fact that you love me not because I am good, but because I am who I am, and that if I turn out worthless, you'll go on loving me just the same." He was 18 or perhaps 19 when he wrote that. It sounds like the young man both moved and perhaps slightly alarmed by the intensity of Tchaikovsky's affection for him in these letters. The nature of the relationship is debated, as you might imagine. Both Tchaikovsky and Bob were gay, as in fact was Tchaikovsky's brother Modest. Some biographers see it as avuncular devotion, others consider a sexual element plausible, although there is no direct evidence for it. But what is beyond doubt is that Bob mattered to Tchaikovsky more than anyone else alive in his final years, and the 6th Symphony, which we're going to discuss today, was dedicated to him. Bob's own story, I should say, has a grim ending. He helped establish the Tchaikovsky Museum at Klin, but he slid into morphine addiction, alcoholism, and depression. And in December 1906, at the age of 35, he shot himself in his uncle's former house. He lived only 13 years longer than Tchaikovsky. After the 5th Symphony in 1888, Tchaikovsky struggled to find the right idea for a new symphony. Symphony number 6. He spent 1891 and 1892 working on a symphony in E-flat. He got it partly orchestrated and then he scrapped it. He told friends it wasn't good enough. Some of the material ended up in the 3rd Piano Concerto, and after his death, Sergei Taneyev and later Semyon Bogatyrev reconstructed the rest, but Tchaikovsky himself rejected it. Then, in February 1893, something arrived to him. He wrote to Bob from Odessa. During my journey, I had the idea for another symphony, this time with a program, but such a program that will remain an enigma to everyone. Let them guess. The symphony shall be entitled A Program Symphony No. 6. The program itself will be suffused with subjectivity, and not infrequently during my travels, while composing it in my head, I wept a great deal. He wept a great deal while composing in his head on a train. That's a man in the grip of something. Now, perhaps, as a composer, I recognize a little bit this kind of state when a piece that you're writing really takes hold of you and, it's inside you and you're inside it, whether you want to be or not, and the music is sort of arriving faster than you can write it down. It's got a flow state, to be in the zone. It doesn't happen very often, but when it does, you really feel that you've got something that's going to work as a piece of music. Anyway, Tchaikovsky sat down to write down his sketches, and within 4 days, the first movement was done. The rough draft of the entire symphony was complete in just 3 weeks, and he wrote at the end of the sketches the following: O Lord, I thank thee. Today, March 24th, completed preliminary sketch well. And he put three exclamation marks after the word well. The orchestration took longer throughout July and August, and the whole thing was finished on the 19th of August, 1893, at his house in Klin. He told Bob, I definitely consider it the best, and especially the most sincere of all my works. I love it as I have never loved any one of my other musical offspring. Now that sentence matters because it breaks this pattern. Tchaikovsky usually loved a piece, then hated it a week later. About this one, he never changed his mind. He also told Bob something else. The form of this symphony will have much that is new, and amongst other things, the finale will not be a noisy allegro, but on the contrary, a long, drawn-out adagio. Now this last detail is worth pausing on. Allegro is an Italian word, and it implies music that is quick, that is cheerful, and as Tchaikovsky said, noisy allegro, sometimes it can mean noisy. The end of a symphony is usually fast, noisy, all the rest of it. And the other word he uses there, adagio, Italian word meaning slow. Often that implies quite reflective, potentially quiet music. So, not the kind of music you would typically end a symphony on at this point. So the standard symphony of Tchaikovsky's day has 4 movements, which are conventionally fast, slow, then a dance, then fast. So the finale, this 4th movement, it's supposed to be, it's conventionally triumphant, or at least energetic, And it resolves things, it resolves the symphony, it ends it. It sends you home from the concert feeling that all is well. The 6th symphony of Tchaikovsky does something very different. But let's rewind a bit. The first movement, it opens with a solo bassoon in its lowest register over quiet double basses. It sounds like someone groping around in the dark, perhaps. This is what it sounds like. I'm going to play it on the piano here. Now, the main part of the first movement introduces 2 contrasting themes, which is conventional at the time to introduce 2 themes in the first movement of a symphony. The first of these 2 themes is agitated, it's restless, it's anxious, but the second theme is a long, sweeping, very tender theme marked teneramente, in Italian for tenderly, that arrives like a memory of happiness rather than happiness itself in the middle of distress. This is what it sounds like on the piano again. that tune. That tune. If you recognise nothing else in this symphony, you'll recognise that, I think. I think it sounds like someone remembering a time when things were good, rather than describing happy times. It sounds like the memory of happy times, the subtle sort of difference, bit of nostalgia to it. Now, the development section, which is the bulk of this first movement, where the two themes are developed along together, this is the conventional procedure for the first movement of a symphony. This development section builds to an enormous climax, and here there's something I want to point out. After the loudest, most anguished passage in a movement, the music suddenly drops to be quiet, and in that sudden hush, 3 trombones with a single trumpet very low in its range and some very soft cellos and basses underneath, they play together a brief passage of music that quotes the Russian Orthodox Requiem chant, the words to which go, "With thy saints, O Christ, give peace to the soul of thy servant." It's only a few bars, and it's quite easy to miss, but it's there. It's definitely there. A prayer for the dead, sort of in the gap between two storms of music. I think probably every Russian Orthodox listener in 1893 would have recognised it. Probably. The music builds again after that, after this quotation. But for a moment, the symphony in this little gap, it's shown you what it's about. It's shown you its true colours, perhaps. Or at least made you think there's something going on here. There's something different happening. This movement, this first movement, ends quietly. The tender second theme returning in a different key, but it's fragile now, as if it knows that it can't last. The second movement, it's a waltz, but there's a catch. It's in 5/4 time. Now, it means 5 beats to a bar, and a normal waltz has 3. So when you try to dance to a waltz, it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, like that. But if you try to dance to this one, which is in 5/4, you get 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. You might trip over if you try to dance to something like that. But it is elegant and it's beautiful, but you know that it's permanently off balance. Tchaikovsky marks it con grazia, with grace. But the displaced rhythm, this 5/4, this displaced rhythm creates a kind of an undertow, an undercurrent that you can never quite sort of settle into. Perhaps you could say it's like watching someone dance at a ball whilst knowing that the ball is a dream, something like that. Again, he's really playing with your sense of memory, the sense of place. It's quite something. Anyway, here's how this waltz in 5/4 time, here's how the opening of it goes. The third movement. This is the one that causes the trouble. It's a march, and it builds from a light, skittering opening to something overwhelming, something huge. Well, here's the march theme first. Here's the march theme. Does that remind you of anything, perhaps? For me, and I don't know, I think this is a bit strange because maybe it's not that similar, but it does remind me somehow of the theme from Raiders of the Lost Ark, which came out nearly 90 years after the symphony. I'm not suggesting that John Williams pinched it, but I think there's a bit of a kind of resemblance here. Anyway, about halfway through this third movement, the march takes over completely and the orchestra drives forward with tremendous energy. The brass blaze away, thundering timpani, and by the end, the effect is colossal. It's huge. It sounds exactly like a symphonic finale. And at the premiere, the first performance of this symphony, and at many performances since, the audience bursts into applause at the end of this movement, thinking that the symphony is over. And there is a technical reason it sounds so convincingly like an ending. I was going to explain this for you for a moment. I think it's quite interesting, but I'll put my composer's hat on for a moment. Now, the first movement is in B minor, but it ends in B major, the relative major key, which gives the end of that first movement a sort of feeling of perhaps hope, or at least some kind of resolution. The second movement is in D major, which is the relative major of B minors. They have the same key signature, they're related keys. So that continues D major, it continues the optimistic major key, optimistic direction, even though this 5/4 time signature of this strange waltz keeps the listener slightly uneasy, as if things aren't quite as settled as they seem. But you're in D major now. So the third movement arrives in G major. Now G major has been harmonically prepared for you by this D major of the second movement, because D is what we call the dominant of G. So you feel that D resolves into G. You feel that G is an ending in relation to D, and you've been hearing this D major for quite a long time. So by the time the march reaches its blazing conclusion, this big sort of G major feel, it feels like the natural destination of a harmonic journey that has been building across all of these movements. So D major pointing to G major, and G major delivering with full orchestral force. And that's why the audience claps. You almost can't help it. You've been totally tricked into believing this is the end. It's absolutely structurally in the piece of music. I'll play for you now on the piano how these keys work and see if you can hear. Now this is the whole symphony in a few seconds, I suppose, up to this point, these first three movements. See if you can hear what I'm saying here about the way that these keys structurally work to lead you to think you've reached an ending. Okay, so B minor, that begins. By the end of the movement, B major. Then, second movement, D major, relative of B minor. And D leads naturally to G major. G major, that's the third movement, your march, your false ending. But here's how the fourth movement begins. Ambiguous harmony, which resolves to B minor. B minor again. So that's the whole symphony's harmonic structure in a nutshell. So this is what makes the fourth movement such a shock after that third movement, after that sense of ending. We haven't heard anything in B minor, the opening key of the symphony, for a long time, not since the beginning. And Tchaikovsky doesn't reveal it again straight away. You have this opening chorale type of music, almost a bit like a hymn, and it's harmonically ambiguous, unsettled. You can't quite tell what key you're in now. It's as if the music itself doesn't want to admit where it's going. The main theme of the finale, when it arrives, is worth listening for very carefully. I'm not going to play it for you. I want you to experience it for yourself. But notice, when you hear it, how it recalls the gorgeous tender theme from the first movement, that sweeping melody that I played for you earlier on the piano. The shape is quite similar. The emotional territory of it is quite related, I think. But where the first movement's theme was tender and expansive, the version in the finale is somehow sadder, more anguished, more broken. It sounds like someone maybe trying to speak through sobbing. The melody fragments into gasps, into silences, unable to sustain a full phrase. This is the absolute height of musical romanticism, a theme that carries the memory of beauty but can no longer hold itself together emotionally. And the harmony here tells the same story. The theme actually begins in D major, that warm, hopeful tonality of the second movement, but it can't stay there. It slides back into B minor, relative minor, its darker other side. And once there, it cannot escape. The final pages of the symphony are very much in B minor, and there is no redemption. The fourth movement, the finale, is marked Adagio lamentoso, lamenting. After the blaze of this march, the third movement, the strings enter into this fourth movement with this descending theme, this little chorale. It falls, keeps falling. This is what it sounds like. Now, I want to share with you something about this passage, this little chorale that I've noticed when I've been playing this symphony in orchestras. I play the violin, so I play the violin part of this symphony. And the first time you hear that descending theme, it's divided between the first and the second violins in a way that makes each individual part, despite sounding like a straightforward downward scale, each individual part that makes it up is angular and strange. It's sort of full of leaps, almost atonal. I'll play the different parts for you on the piano now, and you won't recognise the tune from the two violin parts. Here are the two first and second violin parts. And the second violin. But when the two interlock, note by note, it comes out as a smooth descending line, like this. So the audience hears serenity. The players, nonetheless, are playing something that sounds to them disjointed, perhaps painful. Are they putting on a show, perhaps, of some kind? When the theme returns later, however, in the movement, so right at the start is where we first hear it, and then at figure G, you have these rehearsal figures, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So at figure G in the music, this theme, this chorale returns. And Tchaikovsky redistributes these same notes between the two sections, and this time each part is stepwise and tonal, just like a little scale. A straightforward melody in its own right. Here's the first violin. And the second violin. Now the combined effect of this is the same, exactly the same descending line, the same chorale, the same tune, but now the individual experience of playing it in the violins matches what the audience hears. Why would you do this? Why would you start with the painful angular version and then change to this more simplified version sort of halfway through the movement? Now one answer you could say is purely sonic. There is a difference. The angular version creates a shimmering, unsettled texture that the stepwise version then calms. But I think there's something else going on. In the late 19th century, orchestras sat with the first violins on the conductor's left and the second violins on the right. So they're facing each other across the stage. It's called antiphonal string, is the technical term. And this was standard everywhere. And with that seating, the composite melody combined between the first and second violin sweeps physically across the space. It bounces between them, each note arriving from a different direction. So the first time you hear a serene descent of this scale, whilst hidden beneath it is anguish. And you can kind of perceive that anguish with the notes bouncing between the first and the second violin. But the second time, the anguish has been resolved, as if, perhaps something suppressed has finally been allowed to surface and settle. I don't know. It's a journey from, shall we say, concealment to acceptance, played out in the distribution of the notes between the two groups of players sitting on opposite sides of the stage. Make of that what you will. I found it very interesting when I was playing it. I could not understand why he had done it. But today, however, most orchestras will put all the violins together on the left. This was introduced as a convention by someone called Leopold Stokowski, and he introduced it with the Philadelphia Orchestra in the 1920s, and it spread from there. So many orchestras will perform like that now, particularly amateur orchestras. Some of the professional orchestras will play around with the string seating for different kinds of, to meet the needs of the music in different ways. But with Stokowski's seating, with all the violins, first and second, to the left of the conductor, you lose the spatial effect entirely. Now, various conductors have gone back to the old seating for this symphony, and when you hear this symphony played that way, you can hear that difference in the opening of the finale. But you can't hear it if all the violins seated over to the left. So watch out for that next time you're watching an orchestra, and think about how the sound is moving around the section. Anyway, this movement, the finale, the fourth movement, it builds to a climax of grief, but then subsides. The closing pages are almost inaudible. There is, right at the end, a single stroke of the tam-tam, which is a gigantic gong, but very, very soft. The only note that the tam-tam plays in the whole symphony. There's a low sort of brass chorale at the end, and the cellos and basses just alone, descending right to the bottom of their range, getting quieter and quieter. Now, in the score, in Tchaikovsky's music, he marks this ending with 6 Ps. P, 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 P. Right, now if you play music, you might remember that when you see P means softly or quietly, play quietly, and then if PP means play very quietly. Normally you don't get more than PP meaning very, very quiet. But he's written 6 Ps. Absolutely, maybe that's as close a notation for silence as you can get in the end of the 19th century. And the final instruction is also written the word in the score, morendo, meaning dying away, dying. So there's no resolution really, no major key redemption. The music just stops in silence. Now the point about the structure, the third movement, that enormous march, it's a false ending. Tchaikovsky constructs a conventional symphonic triumph and then, in this fourth movement, reveals it as hollow. That was performance, a public face, something loud enough to make the audience clap. Then the real finale arrives and says, that was the mask, this is the truth. a symphony that tells a lie, then tells the truth about the lie. So the symphony was first performed without a subtitle, contrary to what Tchaikovsky had written in his notes. But Tchaikovsky's brother Modest later claimed that the morning after the premiere, he suggested the title Pathétique, and Pyotr, his brother, agreed, saying, "Splendid, Modi, bravo." It's a good story, but it isn't true. Letters from the publisher Jurgensen, preserved at the Tchaikovsky Museum at Klin, show that the word pathétique appears on the manuscript title page weeks before the premiere. Tchaikovsky himself wrote on the autograph score, dated 19th of August, 1893, to Vladimir Lvovich Davidov, that's Bob, of course, Pathétique Symphony, number 6. Modest, his brother, it seems, liked to give himself a greater role in his brother's creation than he actually played. Just one thing about this word itself, pathétique. It's a French word, but it doesn't mean pathetic in the modern English sense of the word pathetic. Nobody's saying this symphony is kind of pathetic or rubbish in any way. The Russian word, like the French, means something closer to impassioned or full of suffering. The closest word to that we might commonly encounter in English is pathos rather than pathetic. And Beethoven used the same title, pathétique, for his piano sonata, number 8, the Pathétique Sonata, which Tchaikovsky would have known. But the premiere of this symphony took place on Saturday, the 16th of October, 1893, in the hall of the Assembly of Nobles in St. Petersburg. Tchaikovsky conducted. The audience included Rimsky-Korsakov and much of the city's musical establishment. The reception was polite, shall we say, confused, perhaps. After the concert, Tchaikovsky wrote to Jurgensen, the publisher, "Something strange is happening with this symphony. It's not that it displeased, but it has caused some bewilderment. So far as I myself am concerned, I'm more proud of it than any of my other works." During the last rehearsal, the Grand Duke Konstantin Konstantinovich, who was a poet as well, ran into the green room weeping and exclaiming, "What have you done? It's a requiem, a requiem." The Grand Duke, at least, heard what was in the music. Tchaikovsky was still thinking about the finale on the 19th of October. He told his friend Nikolai Kashkin that he might rewrite it. Whether he would have done so, we will never know. Because on Wednesday, 20th of October, 4 days after the premiere on the Saturday, Tchaikovsky went to the Alexandrinsky Theatre to see a play. Afterwards, he went with Modest, his brother, Bob, and the composer Glazunov to a restaurant called Liner's on the Nevsky Prospect, a big road in the middle of St. Petersburg. According to the standard account of this story, Tchaikovsky drank a glass of unboiled water despite a cholera epidemic that was winding down but still present in St. Petersburg at the time. Over the next 2 days, he developed the symptoms of cholera, vomiting, diarrhea, dehydration. Doctors were called. His condition worsened. His kidneys failed. At about 3 a.m. on the 25th of October, Old Style, which is 6th of November in on one calendar, he died. He was 53 years old. Tsar Alexander III paid for the funeral. Over 60,000 people applied for tickets to the Requiem at Kazan Cathedral. 8,000 were crammed into a building that supposedly had a capacity of 6,000. He was buried in the Tikhvin cemetery at the Alexander Nevsky Monastery near Glinka, Mussorgsky, and later Rimsky-Korsakov and Borodin. And that would be the end of this story, except for a question. The body was laid out in an open coffin at Modest's apartment. Mourners came and went freely. The cellist Alexander Verzibilovich, drunk, repeatedly kissed the dead man's face. Now this is not how cholera deaths were normally handled. Cholera victims were supposed to be sealed up and isolated so that the disease wouldn't spread. Rimsky-Korsakov, in his autobiography, called the open coffin a strange thing. Now, in 1979, the musicologist Alexandra Orlova, who had emigrated from the Soviet Union, published a theory she attributed to a chain of informants going back decades. According to this account, a nobleman had complained to the Tsar about Tchaikovsky's sexual conduct with a young man. The letter was intercepted by a senior government official named Nikolai Jacobi, a fellow alumnus of the School of Jurisprudence where Tchaikovsky had been educated. Now, rather than forwarding this letter to the Tsar, Jacobi convened an informal tribunal of former classmates. After a 5-hour meeting, Tchaikovsky was told he must take his own life by poison to prevent a public scandal, and apparently he complied. Now, this theory was taken up by the biographer Anthony Holden and the scholar David Brown. It makes a certain dramatic sense, I suppose. The last symphony as a conscious farewell, the finale as a man composing his own requiem. But the musicologist Alexander Poznansky, in 2 books published in 1991 1996, challenged this account in detail. He points out the following: that the supposed nobleman had the wrong title. Orlova called him a duke, but no such rank exists in the Russian peerage. He showed that Tchaikovsky's documented schedule allowed no time for a so-called tribunal lasting 5 hours. He argued that no poison can reliably imitate the specific stage symptoms of cholera which were documented, and he noted that the cover-up would have required dozens of conspirators with no obvious reason to keep silent. In fact, you might say plenty of reasons not to keep silent. He also points out that the entire theory rests on this chain of informants of third-hand testimony passed through several people over decades, recorded by a single émigré 86 years after the event. So I don't know if that seems plausible to you. Not sure. The open coffin, what about that? Well, Poznansky found that the St. Petersburg health authorities had relaxed the cholera isolation rules earlier in 1893, and that constant disinfectant was applied to the body. So where does this leave us? The current scholarly weight is firmly behind cholera, perhaps the more simple, plausible reason. Poznansky's position has been endorsed by many illustrious historians like Richard Taruskin, Simon Karlinsky and others. The suicide theory hasn't been disproven, but that's really because a death from 1893 can never be conclusively settled. And it rests on evidence that most specialists would now consider, and perhaps most reasonable people would consider, quite insufficient. Modest did destroy some of his brother's diary pages after his death, and we don't know what was in them, although the likeliest answer is probably material about Pyotr's homosexual life, which Modest wanted to suppress from the public record. The destruction of these pages keeps a sort of permanent margin of doubt, and that margin has proved, inevitably perhaps, fertile ground for theories, should we say conspiracy theories. Now I want to present to you both possibilities and let you decide. If you believe the suicide theory, the Sixth Symphony perhaps becomes a conscious farewell, and the final movement becomes a man writing about his own death. If, on the other hand, you believe the cholera theory, the symphony is a great work of art whose coincidence with its composer's death is tragic but accidental. The notes on the page are the same either way. What changes is simply how you hear them, how you choose to interpret them. A second performance of this symphony took place 12 days after Tchaikovsky's death, in the same hall with the same orchestra, this time conducted by Eduard Napravnik. The stage was draped in black. A bust of the composer of Tchaikovsky stood on display. Now the audience heard the finale as a premonition. Whether or not that was intended, the symphony became, from that performance onwards, one of the most popular works in the orchestral repertoire. Other composers noticed. Mahler's Ninth Symphony, composed in 1909, also ends with a slow adagio that fades to silence in the strings. Mahler had heard the Pathetique as early as 1894 and conducted it himself. Shostakovich revered Tchaikovsky and modelled aspects of his own catastrophic finales of his symphonies on this one, the Sixth Symphony of Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky ended the assumption that a symphony had to close with a triumph. After the Pathetique, tragedy became a sort of a legitimate destination for a symphonic work. Modest spent the rest of his life curating his brother's legacy. He built the museum at Klin, he wrote a biography, he edited what he wanted posterity to see and destroyed what he didn't. His tampering with the diaries is documented. What exactly he removed, we will never know. Now, watching and listening, how to explore this symphony for yourself. And I want to recommend a film. It's a bit of a controversial film. And you may not be able to find it, but I think it's worth seeing if you can. It's by Ken Russell, and it's called The Music Lovers. It's from 1970, It stars Richard Chamberlain as Tchaikovsky and Glenda Jackson as his wife Antonina. Now, Ken Russell pitched it to the film studio as, quote, a film about a homosexual who marries a nymphomaniac. This film is vulgar, it's excessive, it's melodramatic, and it's self-indulgent. But I think it's magnificent and it's glorious. Anyway, the critic, Pauline Kael, said watching it made you want to, quote, drive a stake through the heart of the man who made it. Time Out, the magazine, called it all those things and then added, gloriously so. It's as a film, it's not in any way really a reliable biography. Ken Russell invents things freely and he conflates events, and interestingly, he also conflates the two theories about Tchaikovsky's death. In the film, Tchaikovsky deliberately drinks a glass of cholera-infected water, so the cholera is real but self-inflicted in this telling of the story. I guess it's a neat piece of screenwriting, even if it's not history. But it captures something true about the gap between Tchaikovsky's emotional life and his public mask. And Glenda Jackson's performance, if you watch the film, as Antonina, absolutely devastating piece of acting. Andrei Previn arranged and conducted the music for the film and defended the film as, quote, the best film ever made about a composer. Whether or not you agree after you see it, it's certainly unforgettable. Now, Chamberlain, the actor who played Tchaikovsky himself, came out as gay only in 2003. Now, some recordings of the Sixth Symphony to listen to. For a first listen, the recording I'd suggest, and these will be on the playlist on Spotify. The first recording I'd suggest is Mravinsky and the Leningrad Philharmonic from 1960. Leningrad, as it was called at that point. St. Petersburg before and St. Petersburg again now. And that's on Deutsche Grammophon. Yevgeny Mravinsky conducted this symphony hundreds of times over 50 years, and he knew it from the inside as probably few conductors otherwise have known it. His reading is lean, it's fierce, it's unsentimental, and it's really kind of the version against which all others are measured. The BBC ranked it as number 9 in their list of the 50 greatest recordings of all time, so worth a listen. But for a very different experience, try Leonard Bernstein and the New York Philharmonic, and that's from 1986, also on Deutsche Grammophon, and that's recorded live at Avery Fisher Hall. Bernstein takes the finale to last about 17 minutes. 17 minutes against the usual 10, so played an awful lot slower than it's usually played. The whole performance of this symphony runs about an hour. It's slow, it's agonised, and it's emotionally overwhelming, I think. Bernstein at this point was 68 and had only 4 years left to live. Critics are divided about this one. Some find the finale unsustainably slow. Others regard it as a profound personal statement. So I think you should hear it. You should make up your own mind about this interpretation. So for a third one, I'm going to recommend something more recent. Theodor Kurentzis and Music Eterna on Sony Classical, and this is from 2017. Kurentzis studied with Ilya Musin, who had been a student of Mravinsky. So there is a lineage from that Mravinsky recording, perhaps. Now this is another sort of lean, raw, fierce reading, very, very different from the Bernstein, perhaps more similar to Mravinsky. And the third movement march in particular sounds, I would say, kind of menacing. Menacing, shall we say. If you listen to the Mravinsky recording and the Bernstein on the same day, you will hear the same notes interpreted in such different ways that they all may sound like two different pieces of music. And that's performed music for you. The score is fixed, but what it means is made new every time someone plays it. And that's a huge difference with this kind of music and music that exists only to be on a recording, like pop music, for example. So I said at the start of the first of these two-part set of episodes that these two works sit at completely opposite ends of what music can be and what music can do. The 1812 Overture is public, it's celebratory, it was a commissioned piece, and the composer didn't care about it. The Sixth Symphony is private, it's devastating, self-generated, it was not commissioned, and the composer loved it as he had loved nothing else. One of these pieces ends with cannon fire, and the other ends in silence. Such a contrast. And there's an irony in Tchaikovsky's career that I think is worth just ending with. His most popular works, the 1812 Overture, the Nutcracker. They're the ones he valued least. The Sixth Symphony, which he valued most, it remains less widely known outside concert halls. The public wanted the fireworks. The composer wanted the silence. What does that say about the relationship between an artist and an audience? As a composer, I think it is the kind of thing that you think about. In the middle of the night, keeps you up at night. What's the real relationship between what you're doing and what the audience is hearing? Do you care about the audience while you're writing? Anyway, enough about my music. Go and listen to some Tchaikovsky, go and listen to the Mravinsky recording, or go and see it live if you possibly can. It'll be overwhelming. And if you haven't heard the 1812 Overture yet, listen to that first and hear the contrast. I'll go and work on the next podcast now. I'll give you a sneak preview. It's going to be about Mozart this time. So I'll go and do that. You go and listen to some Tchaikovsky. Bye for now.